Welcome to the Explainer. Imagine waking up in a world where almost overnight, up to 60% of everyone you know just vanishes. Villages are left completely empty, crops are literally rotting in the fields, and the sheer volume of the dead entirely overwhelms any attempt at a proper burial. Today, we're looking at a catastrophe so absolute and so devastating that it fundamentally altered the course of human history. We are, of course, talking about the Black Death, the medieval plague pandemic that completely swept through Eurasia and North Africa between 1346 and 1353. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this tragedy, listen to these visceral words from Angelo di Tura. He was an Italian chronicler who actually survived the pandemic in the city of Siena. He wrote about fathers abandoning their children and wives abandoning their husbands. He personally buried 5 of his own children with his own hands in massive, overflowing trench graves. When he wrote, "And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world," he wasn't exaggerating. For the people living through the mid-14th century, the apocalypse had seemingly arrived. Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the origins of the plague, then move into its transmission and spread. After that, we'll look at the symptoms and suffering, explore how it created a changed world, and finally, discuss its modern status and future. All right, let's dive into part 1, Origins of the Plague, Microscopic Culprits and Ancient Ancestors. Take a look at this pink cluster. Believe it or not, this tiny thing is Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. For a really long time, the exact origins of the Black Death were heavily debated, but modern DNA analysis has given us some incredible clarity. Recent research actually found the oldest known traces of Yersinia pestis in the teeth of ancient hunter-gatherers near Lake Baikal in Siberia, dating back a staggering 5,500 years. However, the specific genetic ancestor of the Black Death strain that devastated Europe, well, that's been traced to a very specific origin point in Central Asia near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, right around the years 1338 to 1339. So how exactly does a microscopic bacterium in Central Asia manage to conquer the world? Meet the primary vector, the oriental rat flea, or Xenocilla chaopes. The biological mechanism at play here is as fascinating as it is deadly. You see, the Yersinia pestis bacteria multiply inside the flea and form this dense biofilm that completely blocks the flea's gut. Because the flea can't swallow any blood, it begins to starve, and this starvation drives the flea into an absolute aggressive feeding frenzy. It bites a host, like a rat or a human, but because its gut is totally blocked, it ends up regurgitating thousands of plague bacteria directly into the bite wound, infecting the new host. Now, you have to remember, 14th century victims had absolutely zero idea what bacteria or fleas even were. Instead, they relied on concepts like the miasma theory. A report by the highly esteemed medical faculty of Paris at the time confidently stated that a conjunction of planets, specifically Jupiter and Saturn, had caused a great pestilence in the air. They genuinely believed that bad air, or miasma, along with these astrological events, were the root cause. This massive gap between the harsh biological reality of fleas and bacteria and the medieval medical understanding of the time left populations completely defenseless. Moving on to Section 2, Transmission and Spread, along the Silk Road to Europe. The real catalyst for this massive transcontinental spread? The Mongol Empire. By creating a vast, highly protected trade network along the Silk Road, they unintentionally built a high-speed highway for the pathogen. In 1346, the plague hit the Mongol Golden Horde army as they were besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea. In an early, completely horrifying instance of biological warfare, the Mongol commander actually catapulted plague-infected corpses right over the city walls. The infected Genoese traders fled by ship, arriving in Sicily in 1347. By 1349, the disease was ravaging London, and by 1353, it had reached all the way to Moscow. Looking at the marine routes marked by arrows here, you can see exactly how ships carried those infected rats and fleas right through the Mediterranean basin. Once it came ashore in places like Italy, France, and Spain, it just exploded inland. Interestingly, historians note that the disease spread way faster than would be expected if it were just rats and fleas doing the work. This tells us that once it hit dense human populations, it also began spreading from person to person through the air, completely engulfing the continent in just a few short years. Which brings us to Section 3, Symptoms and Suffering, the clinical realities of the plague. Once infected, the disease presented in 3 totally distinct and honestly agonizing forms. First up was the bubonic plague. This is the most famous one, characterized by painful oozing swellings in the lymph nodes, called buboes, which usually popped up in the groin, neck, or armpits. Left untreated, about 80% of victims died within 8 days. Then there's the pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs. Victims suffered severe coughing and spat up bright red blood. Because this form was airborne, it spread directly between people, carrying a staggering 90 to 95% mortality rate. Finally, you had the septicemic plague. This infected the bloodstream directly, causing skin tissue to literally die and turn purple or black. Its mortality rate was near 100%, often killing victims before those trademark buboes even had time to form. And the psychological toll of all this suffering was arguably just as severe as the physical one. Look at the Brothers of the Cross, also known as flagellants, who roamed from town to town, violently whipping themselves, genuinely believing the plague was a punishment from God for human sins. To the right, you see a town crier calling for families to bring out your dead. The sheer, unfiltered terror of the situation led to intense religious fanaticism and horrific scapegoating. Desperate to find a cause, mobs attacked and massacred minority groups. Jewish communities were especially targeted and falsely accused of poisoning wells, alongside beggars, pilgrims, and lepers. Let's look at the aftermath in Section 4, A Changed World, and the Fall of Feudalism. 50 million. Let that number sink in for a second. While precise numbers are always debated due to spotty medieval record-keeping, it's estimated that up to 50 million people died in Europe alone. To put that into perspective, that means roughly 50 to 60% of Europe's entire population was wiped out in just a few years. In England alone, historians estimate that roughly 1,000 entire villages simply ceased to exist. They were entirely depopulated. But out of all this devastation emerged a really unexpected economic paradox. Think about it. With more than half the workforce suddenly gone, there was a severe labor shortage. Landowners were absolutely desperate for people to harvest their crops. As a result, the value of land rents completely collapsed, while the wages for peasants and artisans surged. For the first time ever, commoners could actually demand higher pay, or just pack up and move to another estate that offered better terms. This newfound economic mobility was a massive game changer and directly contributed to the destabilization and eventual collapse of the rigid medieval feudal system. Beyond just the economics, there was a profound psychological shift happening. Having been completely surrounded by mass death, the survivors' entire worldview changed. The Roman Catholic Church lost a significant chunk of its spiritual monopoly, mainly because people started questioning why the clergy couldn't stop the plague. Plus, many priests had perished right alongside the commoners. Thinkers in heavily hit areas like Italy began to dwell less on the afterlife and focused way more on their present earthly lives. Historians heavily argue that this intense familiarity with mortality and the shift in focus towards human experience actually paved the way for the Italian Renaissance. Finally, let's turn to Section 5, Modern Status and Future. The threat today? Well, the good news is that science did eventually catch up. In 1894, a scientist named Alexander Yersin finally discovered the bacterium, which was aptly named Yersinia pestis in his honor. Today, modern medicine has largely tamed the disease. Through the use of insecticides to control fleas, early intervention with antibiotics, and vaccines, the case fatality rate for modern plague has been slashed to about 11%. However, and this is absolutely crucial to note, the plague is still enzootic, meaning it's permanently established in rodent populations across various global regions today, including parts of Asia, Africa, and even the western United States. But that leaves us with a pretty critical question. Could drug-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis pose a major health threat in our future? The bacterium is still out there, and it's still evolving. Back in 1995, a completely drug-resistant form of the bacteria was discovered in Madagascar, a country that, by the way, also suffered a highly deadly pneumonic plague outbreak as recently as 2017 that infected thousands. So, while we have powerful antibiotics today, the microscopic killer that ended the medieval world is still out there, waiting in the wild. Could history ever repeat itself? Thank you for joining me on The Explainer.